William James is the philosopher and psychologist who refused to choose between science and soul. He lived from 1842 to 1910, spanning America's transformation from agrarian republic to industrial power. His father was a wealthy Swedenborgian mystic who knew Ralph Waldo Emerson personally. His brother Henry became one of the greatest novelists in the English language. William grew up in a household where dinner conversations ranged across theology, literature, philosophy, and art. The family moved restlessly between New York, Newport, Geneva, Paris, and London throughout his childhood. This cosmopolitan upbringing gave James fluency in German and French, and a mind allergic to narrow specialization. James trained as a physician at Harvard, but never practiced medicine a single day. He taught anatomy, then physiology, then psychology, and finally philosophy at the same university. He wrote the first American psychology textbook, a 1,200-page masterwork called The Principles of Psychology. That book appeared in 1890 after taking him 12 years to complete. He then spent his final 2 decades developing Pragmatism, the most distinctly American philosophy ever created. His influence extends into neuroscience, phenomenology, cognitive science, religious studies, and behavioral economics. Edmund Husserl borrowed his concepts of fringe and halo for phenomenological analysis. Bertrand Russell built his theory of neutral monism directly upon James's doctrine of pure experience. John Dewey transformed American education using James's functional psychology as a foundation. Ludwig Wittgenstein cited James on the absence of will in automatic action. What makes James essential is not merely his ideas, but the method behind them. He demanded that philosophy answer to lived experience rather than abstract systems. He insisted that psychology study the mind in its actual complexity, not artificial laboratory fragments. He argued that truth itself must be understood through its practical consequences for human life. These commitments emerge from his own psychological crisis, which we must understand first. His philosophy was forged in depression, hallucination, and the contemplation of suicide over several years. The resolution of that crisis became the template for his entire intellectual project. He believed that ideas must be tested by what difference they make in practice. He demonstrated that consciousness flows rather than fragments into discrete mental atoms. He proposed that emotions arise from bodily states rather than causing them. He defended the right to hold beliefs that cannot be proven, but make life livable. He articulated a metaphysics where experience itself is the fundamental stuff of reality. This is not a survey of isolated doctrines, but an excavation of interconnected insights. Every major idea James developed connects to every other through underlying assumptions about mind and world. His psychology implies his philosophy, and his philosophy implies his psychology. The stream of consciousness doctrine leads directly to radical empiricism. The pragmatic theory of truth emerges from his functionalist approach to mental life. His defense of religious belief rests on the same principles he used to analyze emotion. Understanding James means grasping this unity beneath the apparent diversity of his work. Part 1. The crisis that created a philosophy. In 1867, at age 25, William James travelled to Germany to study physiology. He hoped to become a scientist in the emerging field of experimental psychology. Instead, he fell into a psychological collapse that would last nearly 5 years. He suffered from back pain, digestive troubles, eye problems, and severe depression simultaneously. The physical symptoms were real, but the mental anguish ran far deeper than any bodily ailment. James was experiencing what he later called a crisis of meaning. His scientific training had convinced him that the universe operates through deterministic physical laws. If matter in motion explains everything, then human freedom must be an illusion. If consciousness is merely a byproduct of brain chemistry, then moral striving has no point. James could not escape the logical conclusion that his own thoughts were determined in advance. He described this state as the ebbing of the will to live for lack of philosophy. The paralysis of action came from a sense of moral impotence that scientific materialism seemed to demand. He had panic attacks and hallucinations during this period, just as his father had before him. One episode in particular haunted him for decades and appeared disguised in his later writings. While visiting an asylum as a medical student, he saw an epileptic patient reduced to idiocy. The man sat motionless on a bench, his knees drawn up and arms wrapped around them. James suddenly realized that if determinism is true, he could become exactly like this man. Nothing in his will could prevent such a fate if physical causation governs everything. The dread of life's absolute insecurity pushed him toward becoming an invalid in his parents' home. He considered suicide repeatedly during these years of semi-invalidism and despair. The turning point came in April of 1870, when James was 28 years old. He was reading an essay by Charles Renouvier, a French philosopher influenced by Immanuel Kant. Renouvier defined free will as the sustaining of a thought because one chooses to do so. This definition struck James as something that could actually be tested in experience. If he could hold a thought when other thoughts were equally available, that would prove freedom. The proof would not be logical deduction, but practical demonstration through lived experience. James wrote in his diary that April 30th was a crisis in his life. He decided that Renouvier's definition of free will need not be the definition of an illusion. His next sentence became one of the most famous declarations in the history of philosophy. He wrote that his first act of free will would be to believe in free will. This was not logical argument, but existential commitment, a choice to live as if freedom were real. The decision carried with it the abandonment of all determinisms, both scientific and theological. Notice what James did here, because it reveals the method underlying all his later work. He did not prove free will through abstract reasoning or empirical measurement in a laboratory. He chose to believe it, and then observed what difference that belief made in his life. The belief worked because it ended his paralysis and made moral striving meaningful again. This pragmatic test of truth by consequences became the foundation of his entire philosophy. An idea is true if believing it produces good effects and fits with other established truths. James discovered pragmatism not as academic theory, but as therapeutic intervention in his own psyche. The crisis also taught him that philosophy cannot be separated from the philosopher's temperament. His depression arose from collision between the humane environment of his upbringing and scientific objectivity. His father's religious worldview emphasized spirit, freedom, and cosmic meaning at every level. His scientific training emphasized matter, determinism, and the reduction of mind to mechanism. James could not fully embrace either position because each captured something genuinely important. This personal dilemma became the intellectual agenda for his entire subsequent career. He would spend decades trying to reconcile scientific rigor with respect for human values and purposes. His functionalist psychology emerged from asking what consciousness does rather than what it contains. His pragmatism emerged from asking what difference beliefs make rather than what grounds them abstractly. His radical empiricism emerged from trying to dissolve the dualism between mind and matter entirely. His defense of religious experience emerged from recognizing that mystical states cannot be dismissed scientifically. Every major doctrine connects back to this foundational crisis, and its resolution through willed belief. The biographical context also explains why James wrote so differently from other philosophers of his era. He addressed ordinary educated readers rather than academic specialists speaking only to each other. His prose is vivid, personal, and filled with concrete examples drawn from everyday experience. He wanted philosophy to matter for how people actually live, rather than for scholarly reputation alone. This commitment to relevance made him wildly popular with general audiences in his own time. It also made professional philosophers suspicious of his lack of systematic rigor and technical precision. Critics accused him of being merely a brilliant writer, rather than a genuine philosopher. James accepted this criticism partially, but insisted that philosophy must connect to real human concerns. His family background also shaped his distinctive approach to intellectual problems in lasting ways. The James household encouraged what we might now call intellectual pluralism and tolerance for ambiguity. Henry James Sr. believed that truth could not be captured by any single doctrine or system. He raised his children to appreciate multiple perspectives and resist premature closure on difficult questions. William internalized this attitude and made it central to his mature philosophical position. He called himself a radical empiricist because he refused to exclude any element of actual experience. He called himself a pluralist because he believed reality is genuinely multiple rather than secretly unified. These methodological commitments trace back to childhood conversations around the family dinner table. James also inherited from his father a deep interest in religious and spiritual questions. Henry Sr. had undergone a religious crisis of his own and emerged with unconventional theological views. He rejected institutional Christianity, but embraced Swedenborg's mystical vision of spiritual correspondence. William never adopted his father's specific beliefs, but retained the conviction that religion matters. He could not dismiss religious experience as mere delusion because he had witnessed its power firsthand. His father's transformation from despair to faith provided a template for his own recovery from depression. The Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902, continues this family investigation. James treats religious states as genuine psychological phenomena deserving serious scientific study. Understanding the crisis also illuminates James's distinctive position on the mind and body problem. He knew from personal experience that mental states have physical causes and consequences. His depression involved both psychological despair and concrete bodily symptoms interacting continuously. He could not accept pure materialism because it eliminated the efficacy of conscious choice. He could not accept pure spiritualism because it ignored the obvious dependence of mind on brain. His solution was to deny the sharp dualism between mental and physical altogether. Consciousness and matter are not two different substances, but two aspects of one underlying reality. This radical move, which he called pure experience, emerged directly from his personal crisis. The lesson from James's biography is that great philosophy often emerges from personal necessity. He did not develop pragmatism as an intellectual game or academic exercise in system building. He needed a philosophy that would make life worth living, despite uncertainty and potential meaninglessness. He found that philosophy, by testing beliefs through their consequences rather than their foundations. The test showed that belief in free will works better than belief in determinism for human flourishing. This pragmatic criterion then generalized into a complete theory of truth and meaning. James built his philosophy from the ground up, starting with what he learned fighting depression. That origin story explains both the power and the limitations of everything he subsequently wrote. Part 2. Stream of Consciousness. Against the Atomists. Before James, most psychologists assumed the mind contains discrete mental atoms. British empiricists like John Locke and David Hume analysed experience into separate simple ideas. A sensation of red, a feeling of warmth, a sound of middle C were treated as building blocks. Complex thoughts were supposedly constructed by associating these simple elements together mechanically. James rejected this entire framework as a fundamental misrepresentation of actual mental life. He called it the psychologist's fallacy, confusing our abstractions about mind with mind itself. When you actually examine your own experience carefully, you do not find discrete mental atoms. You find a continuous flow that never stops or breaks into separate pieces. James insisted that consciousness does not appear to itself chopped up in bits. Words like chain or train do not describe it fitly as it presents itself in the first instance. Consciousness is nothing jointed, but flows continuously like a river or stream. This is not metaphor, but literal description of what introspection actually reveals about mental life. The stream metaphor captures several essential features that atomistic psychology completely missed. First, every thought belongs to some personal consciousness and to no other. My thoughts are mine, and yours are yours, and this ownership cannot be transferred between minds. The thoughts themselves feel warm and intimate in a way that belongs to their particular thinker. This personal quality pervades the entire stream from beginning to end without exception. No thought floats free as an independent atom disconnected from a living, feeling subject. Second, within each personal consciousness, thought is always changing and never static. No state once gone can recur and be identical with what it was before. Even if you look at the same object twice, your experience of it differs each time. The second experience contains memory of the first, making it a fundamentally different mental state. We feel the same things, but in different ways, depending on context and history. The stream flows forward and never loops back to exactly the same psychological position. Third, within each personal consciousness, thought is sensibly continuous without gaps or divisions. Even when there are time gaps like sleep or unconsciousness, consciousness does not feel broken. You wake up and the stream resumes with full connection to the stream that preceded sleep. The thoughts before and after the gap feel like they belong together as parts of oneself. This felt continuity is what makes personal identity possible across time and changing states. James called this the sense of sameness that runs through all our different experiences. Fourth, consciousness is always interested in some parts of its object more than others. It constantly selects, chooses, emphasizes, and ignores among the millions of available items. Attention is not an extra faculty added onto consciousness, but its very essence and nature. The mind is at every stage a theatre of simultaneous possibilities that demand selection. Consciousness creates the experience world by choosing what to notice and what to ignore. This selective function connects psychology to biology and the demands of survival in the environment. The stream doctrine directly contradicts the associationist psychology that dominated the 19th century. Associationists believed that ideas connect through mechanical laws of similarity and contiguity. If you experience A, followed by B repeatedly, A will automatically call up B later. This makes the mind a passive machine, following deterministic rules without genuine agency. James argued that this picture ignores the active, selective, purposive character of mental life. We do not passively receive associations, but actively choose which connections to follow and strengthen. The philosophical implications of the stream doctrine extend far beyond technical psychology. If consciousness is continuous rather than atomic, then the British empiricist epistemology collapses. Knowledge cannot be built up from simple impressions combined by association alone. Our experience already comes organized with meaning, relations, and purpose built into its structure. The mind does not construct the world from raw sensory atoms, but encounters a world already meaningful. This insight would later influence phenomenology, Gestalt psychology, and ecological approaches to perception. James also argued that the stream metaphor better fits what neuroscience was beginning to reveal. The brain does not contain separate compartments for each simple idea or sensation. Neural activity is distributed, continuous, and involves massive interconnection between different regions. Every brain state modifies the entire system rather than adding discrete items to a mental container. The psychological continuity of consciousness reflects the physical continuity of brain processes. James saw psychology and neuroscience as partners rather than competitors in understanding the mind. The stream of consciousness concept also has profound implications for how we understand time. We do not experience the present as a knife edge between past and future. James called the experience present the specious present because it has duration and thickness. The specious present extends for a few seconds, containing both fading past and dawning future. Within this thickness, we experience change, movement, and succession directly without inference. The stream flows through time rather than existing as a series of instantaneous snapshots. This temporal thickness means that our consciousness of now includes memory and anticipation inherently. The trailing edge of the specious present contains the just elapsed moments still echoing. The leading edge contains the about-to-arrive moments already shaping our present experience. Past experiences and future expectations colour every moment of conscious life continuously. We never encounter a pure present stripped of temporal context and psychological history. The stream carries its past along and reaches toward its future in every flowing moment. Part 3. The Fringe, the Halo, and the Transitive. James made a distinction that most psychologists before him entirely overlooked and ignored. He separated the substantive parts of consciousness from the transitive parts that connect them. Substantive parts are the relatively stable resting places where the mind pauses on definite images. Transitive parts are the flights between these resting places, the movements from one thought to another. Traditional psychology focused almost exclusively on substantive states because they are easier to capture. The transitive states escape notice because they vanish the moment you try to examine them directly. James compared introspecting transitive states to seizing a spinning top to catch its motion, or trying to turn up the gas lamp quickly enough to see how the darkness looks. The very act of focusing attention on a transitive state transforms it into a substantive one. You cannot catch the flight in mid-air because catching it makes it stop flying immediately. This introspective difficulty explains why psychology kept missing these essential features of mental life. What cannot be easily observed gets treated as if it does not exist at all. The failure to register transitive states produces a completely distorted picture of consciousness. It makes thinking appear as a series of disconnected snapshots rather than continuous flowing movement. James said traditional psychology describes the river as nothing but buckets, pots and pails of water. Even if those containers stood in the stream, the free water would continue flowing between them. The spaces between our clear ideas are not empty gaps, but filled with dynamic transitional content. Ignoring this content means ignoring most of what consciousness actually contains and does. James introduced the concept of the fringe to describe what surrounds each focal thought. Every definite image in consciousness is surrounded by a halo of relations and meanings. When you think of a word, you simultaneously feel its grammatical function and contextual associations. The word comes wrapped in a sense of where it fits and what might follow or precede it. This fringe gives direction and meaning to the focal content without being explicitly thought itself. You feel the fringe rather than think it, but the feeling guides your thinking continuously. The fringe contains what James called feelings of relation that traditional psychology could not recognize. We have a feeling of and connecting two thoughts just as surely as we feel hot or cold. We have a feeling of but-marking contrast, a feeling of if-marking conditionality, a feeling of by-marking causation. These relational feelings are as real and present in consciousness as any sensation of colour or sound. Yet no psychologist before James had taken them seriously as objects of psychological investigation. Language almost refuses to describe them because it evolved to name substantive things rather than relations. The fringe also includes the feeling of knowing that something is familiar or unfamiliar to us. When you hear a name, you immediately feel whether you know the person or not. This feeling precedes any explicit recall of information about the person in question. You feel the relation between the name and your stored knowledge before accessing that knowledge explicitly. James called this the feeling of familiarity, a genuine element of consciousness usually overlooked entirely. Tip-of-the-tongue experiences reveal the fringe dramatically when we feel we know something we cannot say. Another crucial fringe element is the sense of direction or tendency in our thinking. When you begin a sentence, you feel where it is going before you know the exact words. This feeling of tendency guides word selection and grammatical construction without being articulated explicitly. If interrupted mid-sentence, you feel the incomplete intention as a genuine mental state with content. James argued that intentions and tendencies are among the objects of consciousness, not just descriptions from outside. The stream is aware of its own direction from within, not merely following mechanical association laws. The fringe concept has profound implications for understanding meaning and reference in thought. How does a thought reach out beyond itself to refer to something in the world or in memory? James answered that reference is felt in the fringe as part of the thought's total character. A thought about Paris feels different from a thought about London because the fringes differ completely. Even if the focal images were somehow identical, the surrounding halos of meaning would differ. The fringe connects each thought to the entire context of our knowledge and purposes. Edmund Husserl, the founder of Phenomenology, explicitly borrowed James's fringe concept for his own work. Husserl developed the notion of horizontal consciousness based directly on what James had described. Every intentional act has a horizon of implicit meanings surrounding its explicit focal content. The horizon includes what could become focal if attention shifted in various possible directions. Husserl acknowledged James as a major influence on his phenomenological method and concepts. The fringe travelled from American psychology to European philosophy and transformed both traditions significantly. The fringe also explains why context matters so much for understanding any particular thought. The same words or images can mean entirely different things depending on their surrounding fringe content. A word like bank means different things in financial versus geographical contexts because fringes differ. You do not figure out the meaning by logical analysis, but feel it directly in the fringe. Context sensitivity is built into the very structure of consciousness rather than added by interpretation afterward. James showed that meaning is intrinsic to mental life rather than projected onto meaningless sensory atoms. Part 4. Selective attention. Consciousness as filter. James declared that everyone knows what attention is, then complicated that simple observation profoundly. Attention is the taking possession by the mind of one among several simultaneous possible objects or trains of thought. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others. The mind is at every stage a theatre of simultaneous possibilities, far exceeding what can be processed. Millions of items present themselves to the senses, but most never properly enter experience at all. Only those items that interest us are selected from the overwhelming chaos of potential stimuli. This selective function reveals something crucial about the relationship between mind and world. The world as we experience it is not simply given, but actively constructed through attentional selection. Different minds attending to different features will experience the same environment differently. The artist, the scientist, and the child walking through a forest encounter three different forests. Each selects different features as significant based on interests, training, and purposes brought to the scene. The experience world reflects the mind's concerns as much as the environment's objective properties. James emphasized that attention has profound physiological and biological significance for survival. An animal that could not focus on relevant threats and opportunities would not survive long. Attention evolved because environments contain too much information to process everything simultaneously. The brain must filter ruthlessly, letting through only what matters for the organism's current needs. This filtering happens automatically at low levels and deliberately at higher levels of consciousness. Both automatic and voluntary attention serve the same fundamental function of adaptive selection. The selective character of attention connects directly to James's functionalist approach to psychology. He asked what attention does for the organism rather than what attention is made of structurally. The answer is that attention creates a manageable world from an unmanageable flood of stimulation. Without attention, experience would be what James described in his famous phrase about infant perception. The baby's world is one great blooming, buzzing confusion without organization or selective focus. Development means learning what to attend to and what to ignore for effective action in the world. James distinguished between voluntary and involuntary attention based on their different mechanisms. Involuntary attention is pulled by stimuli that grab us through their intensity, novelty, or biological significance. A sudden, loud noise, a flash of movement, or the smell of food capture attention automatically. These automatic captures served ancestral survival needs and remain largely outside conscious control today. Voluntary attention requires effort to sustain focus on things that do not grab us instinctively. Reading difficult philosophy or doing long division demands effortful attention against distraction and boredom. The effort required for voluntary attention fascinated James because it seemed to involve genuine agency. When you force yourself to concentrate on something uninteresting, who or what is doing the forcing? James saw this effortful attention as one place where free will might actually operate in the mind. Choosing what to attend to could be the point where consciousness influences the causal chain directly. If attention is free, then we genuinely shape our experienced world through acts of mental will. This possibility connected James's psychology to his metaphysical defense of human freedom and responsibility. Modern cognitive science has confirmed and extended James's observations about selective attention. Research on inattentional blindness shows that unattended objects can be completely invisible to awareness. Subjects watching a video fail to notice a person in a gorilla suit walking through the scene. Change blindness demonstrates that large changes between scenes go undetected without focused attention. These findings confirm James's claim that attention is constitutive of conscious experience, not merely auxiliary. What you do not attend to does not enter your conscious world, regardless of its subjective presence. James also recognized that attention has limits that constrain what consciousness can accomplish. You cannot attend to many things simultaneously with full focal awareness distributed across all of them. Attention functions more like a spotlight than a floodlight, illuminating one area at a time. This constraint explains why multitasking is largely an illusion involving rapid switching between single tasks. The switching itself consumes cognitive resources and produces errors at each transition point. James would not be surprised that texting while driving produces accidents despite drivers' confidence. The selective function also reveals that consciousness is inherently evaluative rather than neutral. Selection implies criteria for choosing, and those criteria involve values about what matters. Attention is not a passive recording device, but an active agent pursuing goals and interests. The world we experience is a world that matters to us, because attention has already filtered for relevance. Pure objectivity would require attending to everything equally, which is psychologically and biologically impossible. James concluded that the human contribution cannot be weeded out from any account of experience or knowledge. Part 5. The Theory of Self, I, Me, and Personal Identity. James devoted over 100 pages of the Principles to analysing the self and personal identity. He began by distinguishing between the self as knower and the self as known, the I and the me. The me is everything a person can call their own, the empirical self available for examination. The I is the pure ego, the thinker who does the examining and claims ownership of the me. This distinction allowed James to analyse personal identity without getting lost in metaphysical speculation. He could describe what we actually experience as selves before asking deeper philosophical questions. The me divides into three constituents that together compose our sense of who we are. The material self includes our body, our clothes, our family, and our possessions considered as extensions of ourselves. We feel injuries to our possessions as injuries to ourselves because they belong to our material identity. The instinct to accumulate property reflects this deep psychological connection between self and owned objects. When our house burns or our car is stolen, we feel diminished as persons, not just as property owners. James recognized that material self extends outward in circles from body to family to possessions to creations. The social self is the recognition we receive from others who know and evaluate us. James made the provocative claim that a person has as many social selves as there are people who recognize them. We show different faces to our parents, our friends, our employers, and our casual acquaintances. Each relationship calls forth a different version of ourselves that is genuinely part of who we are. The desire for social recognition runs deep and explains much of human motivation and anxiety. We feel shame and pride in relation to our social selves more intensely than almost anything else. The spiritual self is our inner subjective being, our psychic faculties, dispositions, and felt identity. This is the self we are most intimately acquainted with and consider most genuinely ourselves. It includes our ability to think, feel, will, and experience the world from our unique perspective. The spiritual self feels active rather than passive, like a source of effort and attention. James noted that when we introspect the spiritual self, we often find bodily feelings, especially in the head. The sense of mental effort may actually be feelings of muscular tension in the face and scalp. Beyond these constituents, each self has characteristic feelings and emotions attached to it. Self-appreciation includes self-satisfaction when we succeed and self-dissatisfaction when we fail. James proposed a famous formula relating self-esteem to the ratio of successes to pretensions. Our self-feeling depends not on absolute achievements, but on achievements relative to our ambitions. Reducing pretensions can raise self-esteem as effectively as increasing actual successes in the world. The person who claims little and achieves that may feel better than one who claims much and falls short. Each self also prompts characteristic actions aimed at self-seeking and self-preservation. We act to protect and enhance our material, social and spiritual selves against threats and rivals. Much of economic and political behavior becomes comprehensible when understood as self-seeking activity. We accumulate wealth, seek status, and develop our capacities all in service of these different selves. Conflicts arise when the demands of different selves pull in incompatible directions simultaneously. The ascetic renouncing possessions sacrifices material self for the sake of spiritual self-development. James then tackled the pure ego, the I that knows and claims ownership of all these me aspects. Traditional philosophy posited a soul substance underlying personal identity and unifying all experiences. This substantial soul would persist through time as the unchanging core beneath changing psychological states. James questioned whether we need to posit any such entity beyond what experience actually reveals. He proposed that personal identity might be sufficiently explained by the passing thoughts themselves. Each thought appropriates the preceding thoughts as belonging to the same self through felt continuity. The present thought does the appropriating, claiming past thoughts as warm and intimate rather than foreign. This warmth distinguishes my past experiences from your past experiences in direct felt quality. No separate soul substance is needed if the passing thoughts themselves accomplish the identity synthesis. The I is just the current thought performing its function of connecting with previous thoughts in the stream. James admitted this view was counterintuitive, but argued it fits experience better than soul substance theories. Personal identity becomes an achievement of the thought stream rather than a property of an underlying entity. This analysis has influenced subsequent theories of self and personal identity substantially. James anticipated narrative theories of identity where selfhood is constructed through ongoing storytelling. He anticipated social constructionist views, emphasizing how relationships create and maintain our sense of self. He anticipated embodied cognition approaches that locate self-feeling in bodily sensations and actions. The Principles. Chapter on Self remains one of the richest psychological treatments of personal identity ever written. Philosophers and psychologists continue mining it for insights more than a century after publication. Part 6. Habit, the Flywheel of Society. James devoted an early chapter of the Principles to habit because it pervades all mental life. Habit is the enormous flywheel of society, its most precious conservative agent, stabilizing civilization itself. Without habit, every action would require full conscious attention and deliberation from scratch each time. We would exhaust ourselves deciding how to walk, talk, dress, and perform the simplest daily activities. Habit frees consciousness for higher purposes by automating the routine operations of living. What begins as effortful, deliberate action becomes automatic through repetition and practice over time. The physiological basis of habit lies in the plasticity of neural matter organized by repeated use. When a pathway through the nervous system is traversed, it becomes easier to traverse again. The brain is not a fixed machine, but an organ that reshapes itself according to how it is used. Repeated actions carve grooves or channels through which nervous energy flows more readily afterward. This plasticity explains how practice improves performance and why skills become automatic with repetition. James anticipated modern neuroscience research on neuroplasticity and synaptic strengthening through use. The practical implications of understanding habit extend into education, morality, and self-improvement. James declared that we are spinning our own fates, good or evil, never to be undone by any thread. Every smallest stroke of virtue or vice leaves its trace on our nervous system permanently. Young people must make themselves automatons of correct behavior before the age of 30, if possible. After that age, character has largely set like plaster and will never soften again significantly. This advice sounds harsh, but reflects James's understanding of how neural pathways become fixed with use. James offered several maxims for successfully acquiring new habits and breaking old ones. First, launch new habits with as strong and decided an initiative as possible at the beginning. Accumulate circumstances that reinforce the new behavior and eliminate cues that trigger the old pattern. Make a public commitment so that social pressure supports the change you are trying to make. Enlist every possible ally in your struggle and burn your boats behind you, metaphorically speaking. A strong initial commitment is worth many weeks of gradual half-hearted attempts at change. Second, never allow an exception to occur until the new habit is securely rooted in your behavior. Every slip backwards undoes the work of many successful repetitions, building up the new pattern. Continuity of training is essential because each interruption weakens the growing neural pathway. The excuse that just this once will not matter is the most dangerous rationalization for habit formation. James compared it to dropping a ball of string you are carefully winding, undoing more than you gain. Moral and practical education must emphasize this danger of exceptions to developing good habits. Third, Seize every opportunity to act on your resolution and emotional commitment immediately when it arises. A good intention not acted upon weakens rather than strengthens the tendency toward that behavior. Emotional resolutions that evaporate without action leave the person worse off than before feeling anything. The person who reads self-help books but never implements the advice suffers a kind of moral dissipation. Action is the only soil in which feelings and intentions can grow into genuine established habits. Without action, emotional experiences become mere entertainment without lasting character change. Fourth, keep the faculty of effort alive by practicing unnecessary small acts of discipline daily. Do something every day for no other reason than that you would rather not do it. This maintains your capacity for effortful attention and willpower against the day when you really need it. The person who always follows the path of least resistance loses the ability to resist when required. Systematic exercise of voluntary attention and self-denial prepares the mind for genuine moral challenges. James called this keeping your store of willpower in good condition through regular, disciplined exercise. The social implications of habit theory explain why societies remain stable despite individual differences. Each generation inherits habits from the previous generation through education, training, and imitation. These inherited patterns keep behavior within predictable ranges that permit social coordination and trust. Habit keeps different social classes in their prescribed slots much more effectively than law or threat. This conservative function explains both the stability of societies and their resistance to rapid change. James saw habit as a kind of social flywheel, maintaining momentum once patterns are established. Modern research on habit confirms much of what James observed through introspection and common sense. Habits operate through automatic processes that bypass conscious deliberation and attention entirely. They are triggered by environmental cues and produce behaviors without requiring decision or willpower. This automaticity explains both their efficiency and the difficulty of changing established patterns deliberately. Breaking a habit requires disrupting the cue-response connection and substituting a new behavioral routine. James's practical advice remains substantially correct in light of contemporary behavioral science research. Part 7. Memory, Primary, Secondary, and the Specious Present. James analysed memory with characteristic insight, distinguishing types that psychology had conflated together. Primary memory refers to the lingering of just experienced content in consciousness after the stimulus ends. When you hear a sentence, the beginning remains available as you process the middle and end portions. Without this lingering, you could not understand language because words would vanish before combining into meaning. Primary memory extends the specious present, giving consciousness a thickness rather than knife-edge existence. James anticipated what cognitive scientists now call working memory, holding current information for immediate processing. Secondary memory is entirely different, involving the recall of content no longer present in consciousness. When you remember your childhood home, you are not extending a current experience, but retrieving a past one. This retrieval involves knowledge that the remembered content belongs to your personal past history. Secondary memory has two components: the revived content and the sense that it comes from the past. You might have vivid imagery of something that never happened if the pastness feeling were absent. True memory requires both the content and the conviction that this content was previously experienced personally. James described how memory depends on associations formed during the original experience and subsequent processing. The more connections an experience has with other experiences, the more retrievable it becomes later. A fact connected to many other facts has more paths leading back to it than an isolated fact. This explains why meaningful material is remembered better than meaningless material consistently. Meaning provides connections, while nonsense leaves items floating unconnected in the mental network. Education should emphasize meaningful connections rather than rote memorization of isolated information. The specious present received detailed treatment because it reveals how consciousness handles time directly. The present we actually experience is not a mathematical instant with zero duration, but a span. This span extends for a few seconds at most, but contains within it succession and change. We directly perceive one moment giving way to the next within the specious present without inference. James argued against views that we only experience instants and then construct duration through memory afterward. Duration is given in experience just as directly as colour or sound or any other sensory quality. The specious present connects to the stream of consciousness by explaining how thoughts flow into one another. Each present moment contains trailing edges of what just happened and leading edges of what comes next. The stream does not consist of disconnected instantaneous cross-sections following one another mechanically. Each moment overlaps with neighbours, creating the felt continuity that defines conscious experience as a stream. Without this overlap, personal identity across time would become inexplicable and even unintelligible. I remain the same self because my present experience contains my past and anticipates my future inherently. James also discussed why certain memories persist while others fade and become irrecoverable over time. Emotional intensity during encoding strengthens memory traces and makes them more likely to persist. Repetition and rehearsal also strengthen traces by deepening the grooves through which retrieval occurs. But even strong memories can become inaccessible if retrieval paths are broken through disuse or interference. The memory itself may still exist somewhere in the nervous system without any way to reach it. James compared memory retrieval to hunting in a vast storehouse with imperfect knowledge of where items are. Modern memory research has elaborated distinctions James introduced in substantially more complex detail. Working memory corresponds roughly to his primary memory, but involves multiple specialized subsystems. Long-term memory corresponds to his secondary memory, but divides into declarative and procedural types. Episodic memory for personal experiences differs from semantic memory for general knowledge about the world. These finer distinctions refine rather than replace the basic framework James established over a century ago. His fundamental insight that memory involves multiple systems serving different functions remains sound. James also recognized that memory is reconstructive rather than merely reproductive of past experiences. We do not replay recordings, but rebuild past events from fragments guided by schemas and expectations. This reconstruction introduces errors and distortions that feel completely authentic to the rememberer. False memories can seem as vivid and certain as accurate ones because the reconstruction process is similar. James anticipated research showing how memory is unreliable in ways that have profound legal and personal implications. Eyewitness testimony, therapeutic recovered memories, and confident personal recollections can all be wrong. Part 8. Functionalism against Structuralism, the battle for psychology. In the late 19th century, two approaches competed to define psychology as a scientific discipline. Structuralism sought to analyze consciousness into its simplest constituent elements through trained introspection. Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychology laboratory at Leipzig in 1879, pursuing this program. His student Edward Titchener brought structuralism to America and championed it at Cornell for decades. They believed psychology should identify the basic atoms of mind, like chemistry identifies basic chemical elements. James rejected structuralism root and branch as a fundamental misunderstanding of mental life. He denied that consciousness contains discrete, simple elements that can be isolated through introspection. No one ever had a simple sensation by itself because experience comes already organized and meaningful. What structuralists called simple sensations are actually products of sophisticated discrimination and analysis. They are abstractions from the rich flowing stream, not building blocks from which the stream is constructed. The structuralist method of trained introspection was also problematic in James's view. Training introspectors to report simple elements means training them to distort their actual experience. They learn to describe what the theory says they should experience rather than what they actually experience. The method creates the data it claims to discover rather than discovering pre-existing mental atoms. James thought ordinary untrained introspection more reliable because it captures experience before theoretical distortion. Better a rough account of what actually happens than a precise account of what theory says must happen. More fundamentally, James objected to the structuralist focus on contents rather than functions of consciousness. Asking what consciousness is made of misses the more important question of what consciousness does. The mind evolved to serve biological purposes in an organism struggling to survive in its environment. Psychology should ask how mental processes help organisms adapt rather than what elements compose those processes. This functional approach connects psychology to biology, evolution, and practical human concerns directly. Structuralism's element hunting seemed to James scientifically sterile and disconnected from real human problems. James drew his functionalism explicitly from Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Darwin showed that biological traits exist because they contributed to survival and reproduction in ancestral environments. If consciousness had no function, natural selection would not have produced and maintained it across generations. The very existence of mind implies that mind does something useful for the organisms that possess it. Psychology should investigate what that useful something is rather than cataloguing mental contents abstractly. The question about any mental process should be what difference does it make for the organism's success. Functionalism asked different questions than structuralism, and therefore discovered different psychological phenomena. Instead of asking, what is attention made of, functionalists asked, what does attention accomplish for us? The answer involves selecting relevant information from overwhelming environmental complexity for effective action. Instead of asking what elements compose memory, functionalists asked, what function does memory serve? The answer involves using past experience to guide present behavior and anticipate future situations. These functional questions led to insights about adaptation that structural analysis could never provide. The functional approach also opened psychology to studying behavior as well as consciousness. If mental processes exist to guide adaptive behavior, then behavior becomes relevant psychological data. Structuralists focused exclusively on introspective reports about internal conscious states alone. Functionalists could study what organisms actually do in their environments as evidence about psychological processes. This methodological broadening eventually led to behaviorism, which abandoned introspection entirely for behavior observation. James himself did not go that far, but his functionalism prepared the way for Watson and Skinner later. Functionalism also made psychology more relevant to practical applications in education, business, and mental health. If psychology studies how minds adapt to environments, it can help design better environments for human flourishing. John Dewey developed progressive education based explicitly on functionalist psychological principles from James. Industrial psychology emerged to improve worker productivity by understanding psychological functioning in workplaces. Clinical psychology addressed how mental processes break down and how therapeutic interventions might restore function. Structuralism's abstract element hunting offered little practical guidance, while functionalism generated applicable knowledge. James won this battle historically, and functionalism became the dominant approach in American psychology. Structuralism declined after Titchener's death in 1927 and has few defenders today. Contemporary psychology is overwhelmingly functionalist in asking what mental processes do rather than what they contain. Cognitive psychology, evolutionary psychology, and neuroscience all inherit James's functional orientation. The question always is, what purpose does this process serve, and how does it serve that purpose? James established the framework within which most subsequent psychological research has operated successfully. Part 9. The James-Lange Theory of Emotion. Body first, feeling second. The common-sense view of emotion places feelings first and bodily responses second in the causal sequence. We see a bear, feel afraid, and then our heart races and our legs run in response to that fear. The emotion seems to cause the bodily reaction as its natural expression or consequence in behavior. James reversed this sequence in a theory that seemed counterintuitive, but has proved remarkably durable. He proposed that the bodily changes followed directly the perception of the exciting fact without intervening emotion. Our feeling of those same bodily changes as they occur is the emotion, not something prior causing them. Carl Lange, a Danish physiologist, independently proposed a similar theory around the same time. The combined view became known as the James-Lange theory of emotion in psychology textbooks worldwide. Both argued that emotions are constituted by our awareness of bodily states rather than causing them subsequently. We do not cry because we are sad, but rather feel sad because we notice ourselves crying. We do not tremble because we are afraid, but feel afraid because we perceive our trembling body. This reversal has profound implications for understanding what emotions are and how they might be changed. James argued for this view partly through what might be called a subtraction thought experiment. Try to imagine a strong emotion like rage or grief with all bodily feelings completely subtracted out. Remove the quickened heartbeat, the flushed face, the clenched fists, the tight throat and churning stomach. What would be left would be a cold intellectual perception that something rage-worthy or grief-worthy occurred. But this pale cognitive judgment would not feel like rage or grief as we actually experience these emotions. The bodily sensations are not mere accompaniments to emotion, but constitutive of what emotion actually is. The theory implies that emotions are fundamentally perceptions of bodily states rather than special mental faculties. This makes emotion perception continuous with other forms of perception like seeing colours or hearing sounds. Just as we perceive external objects through sensory systems, we perceive our internal bodily states and call that emotion. There is no special emotion faculty distinct from the general capacity to perceive and interpret sensory information. This economy of psychological mechanisms appealed to James's scientific sensibilities and empiricist commitments. Why posit a special emotion module when ordinary perception of bodily states explains the phenomena? The James-Lange theory was challenged in the 1920s by Walter Cannon and Philip Bard. They argued that visceral changes are too slow and undifferentiated to produce the rapid specific emotions we experience. The same physiological arousal accompanies different emotions like fear and anger, making differentiation impossible. Animals with severed connections between viscera and brain still showed emotional behavior normally. Cannon proposed instead that emotions and bodily responses are triggered simultaneously by the brain's thalamus. For decades, the Cannon-Bard theory seemed to have refuted James's counterintuitive account decisively. However, the James-Lange theory has experienced significant revival in recent neuroscience and psychology. Antonio Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis builds directly on James's insight about bodily basis of emotion. Damasio showed that patients with damage to body-sensing brain regions have impaired emotional experience and decision-making. Their cognitive abilities remain intact, but they cannot use bodily feelings to guide choices effectively. This suggests that bodily awareness is necessary for normal emotional function, just as James argued. The soma or body provides markers that influence reasoning in ways that pure cognition alone cannot accomplish. Research on facial feedback also supports the James-Lange theory's basic insight about body-to-mind causation. Studies show that manipulating facial expressions can influence emotional experience in corresponding directions. Holding a pen between your teeth, forcing a smile shape, increases ratings of amusement for cartoons. Botox injections that paralyze frowning muscles reduce experience of negative emotions in some studies. These findings suggest that bodily states do contribute to emotional experience rather than merely expressing it. The causation runs from body to mind, at least partially vindicating James's counterintuitive reversal. The theory also has therapeutic implications that practitioners have explored and sometimes confirmed. If emotion depends on bodily state, then changing bodily state should change emotional experience. Exercise, breathing techniques, posture adjustments, and physical relaxation might reduce negative emotions directly. Acting as if you feel a certain way might gradually induce actually feeling that way through bodily feedback. James himself suggested that to feel cheerful, we should sit up cheerfully and act as if cheerful already. Cognitive behavioral therapy incorporates behavioral interventions that work partly through such bodily channels. The James-Lange theory remains controversial, but has proved far more durable than critics initially expected. Contemporary emotion researchers generally accept that bodily feedback contributes to emotional experience. They dispute how much it contributes relative to cognitive appraisal and other factors influencing emotion. The truth likely involves both bodily input and cognitive interpretation interacting in complex feedback loops. James may have overstated bodily primacy, but his insight about embodiment of emotion was fundamentally correct. Emotions are not disembodied mental states, but involve the whole organism, including its physiological responses. Part 10. Pragmatism as Method. Settling Endless Disputes. Pragmatism began not as a theory, but as a method for clarifying ideas and resolving philosophical disputes. Charles Sanders Peirce introduced this method in 1878, but few people noticed for 20 years. James revived and popularized pragmatism in his 1898 lecture at Berkeley and subsequent writings. He presented it as a way of settling metaphysical disputes that otherwise might be interminable and pointless. The method asks, what practical difference would it make if one opinion rather than another were true? James illustrated the method with a famous story about a squirrel and a man circling a tree. A squirrel clings to one side of a tree trunk while a man tries to see it by walking around the tree. The squirrel moves around the trunk, keeping the tree between itself and the man continuously. Does the man go around the squirrel or not as he circles the tree unsuccessfully trying to see it? The dispute seems endless until we ask what practical meaning the word around has in this context. If around means passing from north to east to south to west of the squirrel, then yes, he goes around. But if around means being first in front, then to the right, then behind, then to the left of the squirrel, then no. The squirrel always faces the man, so he is never behind the squirrel during his circuit around the tree. Once we clarify what around means in terms of practical experiential consequences, the dispute dissolves. There is no further fact to argue about beyond the two different meanings both parties can agree on. The apparent disagreement was really just verbal confusion that pragmatic analysis clears up completely. Many philosophical debates are like this squirrel dispute, arguing past each other through ambiguous terms. The pragmatic method applies this clarifying procedure to all philosophical concepts and disputes systematically. For any concept, we ask what experiences we would have if the concept applies versus if it does not. The entire meaning of the concept lies in the difference it would make for our conduct and experience. Concepts with no experiential consequences are literally meaningless, empty words producing no real thought. James used this principle to critique metaphysical notions that make no practical difference whatsoever. Scholastic disputes about substance, essence, and other abstract categories often fail the pragmatic test. James emphasized that pragmatism is primarily a method rather than a set of doctrines or results. It does not tell you what to believe, but provides a tool for clarifying what your beliefs actually mean. Two people with different metaphysical views might both be pragmatists if they use the method consistently. The method acts as a mediator between positions by finding the practical cash value of each view. Views that seem to differ abstractly might turn out to have identical practical consequences and thus identical meaning. Views that seem similar abstractly might turn out to differ dramatically in their experiential implications. The pragmatic method emerged from Peirce's reflections on how scientists actually clarify their concepts. Scientists do not define terms through abstract verbal formulations alone, but through experimental operations. The meaning of hard is given by specifying tests that distinguish hard from soft objects experimentally. The meaning of soluble is given by specifying what would happen if the substance were placed in solvent. This operational approach to meaning ensures that scientific concepts connect to observable experiential differences. Peirce generalized this scientific practice into a philosophical method for clarifying any concept whatsoever. James extended Peirce's method in directions that Peirce himself resisted and eventually disowned publicly. Peirce focused on logical and scientific clarification, maintaining rigorous standards for meaningful concepts. James applied pragmatism to religious, moral, and personal questions where experimental verification seems impossible. He asked what practical difference it makes to believe in God, freedom, or moral responsibility. If believing these things makes life better and action more effective, that counts as pragmatic validation. Peirce thought James had corrupted the method by loosening its scientific rigor for popular appeal. James defended his extension by arguing that consequences include emotional and personal consequences, not just logical ones. A belief that makes life meaningful and action possible has consequences as real as any laboratory result. The person who believes in free will and moral responsibility lives and acts differently from the determinist. These differences in how people actually conduct their lives count as practical consequences of their beliefs. James rejected Peirce's restriction of pragmatism to narrowly scientific contexts as arbitrary and unnecessarily limiting. The method should apply wherever beliefs make a difference in how people experience and navigate the world. Part 11. The Pragmatic Theory of Truth, When Ideas Work. James developed pragmatic method into a theory of what truth itself means and how it operates. Traditional theories held that truth is correspondence between ideas and reality, or coherence among ideas themselves. James did not reject correspondence and coherence, but asked what these concepts practically amount to. When we call an idea true, what difference does that attribution make in our actual experience and conduct? His answer was that true ideas are those that work, that successfully guide us through experience reliably. Truth happens to an idea when that idea proves useful for navigating reality and connecting experiences. The pragmatic theory holds that truth is not a static property that ideas possess eternally and independently. Truth is something that happens to ideas through a process of verification in the course of experience. An idea becomes true or is made true insofar as it helps us deal with reality successfully over time. Before verification, an idea may be potentially true, but not yet actually true in the full sense. Truth is a verb more than a noun, a process rather than a property sitting passively in propositions. James said the true is only the expedient in the way of our thinking, just as right is expedient in conduct. This formulation provoked outrage among critics who accused James of reducing truth to mere convenience. If truth is just what works or what is expedient, then comfortable delusions would count as true beliefs. Wishful thinking would become legitimate if it made the believer feel good and function better temporarily. James spent years responding to these criticisms and clarifying what he actually meant by working and expediency. He insisted that expedient does not mean convenient in the short term, but what works in the long run comprehensively. An idea must work with the whole body of our other beliefs and our ongoing experience of reality. Working means fitting with other truths we already possess, and not conflicting with stubborn experience facts. A belief cannot work if it clashes with sensory experience that refuses to accommodate our wishful interpretations. A belief cannot work if it contradicts other beliefs that we have verified and are unwilling to abandon. The constraints on truth are severe, even if they are experiential rather than transcendental in nature. James emphasized these resisting factors in truth-making that critics often ignored when attacking his view. Truth is not whatever we want to believe, but what survives the test of comprehensive experiential consistency. The pragmatic theory also emphasizes that truth has a temporal dimension often overlooked in traditional accounts. New truths must graft onto old truths, preserving as much of the previous stock as possible while accommodating new facts. We do not remake our entire belief system every time we encounter something surprising or challenging. Instead, we minimally revise existing beliefs to accommodate new experience while maintaining maximum continuity. This conservative aspect of truth-making explains how knowledge accumulates historically rather than starting fresh each generation. The most ancient parts of truth were also once new and also had to earn their place through verification. James's theory connects truth to human purposes and interests without making truth merely subjective or arbitrary. We carve out truths from reality just as we carve out constellations from the random distribution of stars. The human contribution to truth cannot be eliminated because truth involves selective attention and conceptualization. Different cultures and different eras might carve different truths from the same underlying reality legitimately. But the carving is constrained by reality's resistance to our wishes and the need for internal consistency. James called this the humanistic principle, that you cannot weed out the human contribution from knowledge. The pragmatic theory applies differently to different domains of belief and types of truth claims. Empirical truths about physical objects face direct sensory verification and allow little interpretive flexibility. Mathematical and logical truths work through internal consistency and deductive relationships among concepts. Moral and religious truths work through their consequences for how people actually live their lives over time. James did not claim that all truths work in the same way or face the same verification conditions. The pragmatic criterion adapts to subject matter while maintaining the core insight that truth involves working successfully. Critics, from Bertrand Russell to modern correspondence theorists, have continued objecting to pragmatism about truth. They argue that truth and usefulness are different properties that can come apart in obvious cases. A true belief might be useless, and a false belief might prove extremely useful in particular circumstances. James would respond that such cases involve short-term or partial usefulness, not comprehensive long-term working. A false belief will eventually clash with experience or other beliefs, even if temporarily convenient. The debate between pragmatist and correspondence theories of truth remains unresolved in contemporary philosophy. Part 12. Radical Empiricism. Relations are real. Radical empiricism is James's attempt to provide a philosophical foundation for his psychology and pragmatism. It is empiricism because it holds that knowledge derives from experience rather than innate ideas or pure reason. It is radical because it refuses to exclude any element that is actually experienced from philosophical consideration. Traditional empiricists like Hume restricted experience to discrete impressions and ideas connected by mental habits. They denied that we directly experience the relations that connect things, treating relations as mental additions. James insisted that relations are experienced just as directly as the things they relate, neither more nor less. James formulated radical empiricism as a postulate, a statement of fact, and a generalized conclusion. The postulate is that only things definable in experiential terms shall be debatable among philosophers seriously. This rules out appeals to transcendent realities or non-experiential entities as explanations for anything observable. If a concept cannot be cashed out in experiential terms, it fails the pragmatic test and should be abandoned. This postulate restricts philosophy to what can be encountered within experience broadly understood. It excludes Kantian things in themselves and other supposed realities beyond all possible experience. The statement of fact is that relations between things are just as much matters of direct experience as things themselves. We do not merely experience objects and then infer or construct relations between them through mental operations. We directly experience with and beside, between, before, after, similar to, different from, and countless other relations. These conjunctive relations are given in experience as surely as colours, sounds, or any other experiential content. James especially emphasized conjunctive relations that traditional empiricists had neglected or explained away. The continuity and connection in experience is real, not a projection or mental construction imposed on atomistic data. The conclusion is that experience holds together from next to next by relations that are themselves parts of experience. The universe, as directly apprehended, needs no extraneous trans-empirical connective support from outside experience. Neither God, nor transcendental ego, nor absolute mind is needed to connect experiences into a unified world. Experience itself possesses sufficient internal structure and continuity to constitute a coherent reality. This conclusion opposes both rationalist appeals to transcendent unifying principles and empiricist skeptical atomism. James offers a middle way, where unity and connection are real, but given in experience rather than imposed from beyond. This position distinguishes radical empiricism from classical British empiricism in crucial respects. Hume analysed experience into discrete atomic impressions, with connections supplied only by mental habit and association. The connections were not themselves perceived, but resulted from the mind's tendency to combine frequently paired impressions. This left relations as merely subjective projections rather than discovered features of experienced reality itself. Hume's conclusion was skeptical, denying that we know causal connections or continuous selves existing through time. James rejected this skepticism by insisting that we directly experience the connections Hume said we merely project. Radical empiricism also opposes rationalist and idealist philosophies that posit transcendent connective principles. Kant argued that the mind imposes categories of connection onto raw sensory data to produce intelligible experience. Absolute idealists argued that ultimate reality is a unified mind that encompasses all finite experiences as parts. Both views locate connection outside experience in structures that organize experience but are not themselves experienced. James denied the need for any such trans-empirical unifiers because experience comes already connected and organized. The world is connected, but the connections are within experience, not behind or above or beneath it. The doctrine has implications for understanding knowledge, reality, and the relationship between mind and world. If relations are real and experienced, then knowledge does not require bridging a gap between isolated mind and external world. We are already connected to reality through the experienced relations that constitute our experience from the start. The problem of how mind contacts world dissolves because mind and world are not separate substances requiring connection. This dissolution of traditional epistemological problems was central to James's philosophical agenda. Radical empiricism provides the metaphysical framework within which pragmatism operates and makes sense. Part 13. Pure Experience and Neutral Monism, Dissolving Dualism. In 1904, James published a provocative essay titled "Does Consciousness Exist as a Distinct Entity?" His answer was no. Consciousness is not a special substance or stuff different from the physical world. This denial of consciousness as a separate entity seems to contradict his entire psychological work on mental life. But James was not denying that experience exists, only that it belongs to a fundamentally mental category. What exists is pure experience, which is neither mental nor physical, but prior to that distinction altogether. Mind and matter are not two kinds of stuff, but two different ways of organizing one fundamental reality. Pure experience is the immediate flux of life before it gets categorized as inner thought or outer thing. James described it as that which is not yet any definite, what though ready to be all sorts of whats. The same bit of pure experience can count as physical or mental depending on what relations it enters into. When experience functions in one context of relations, we call it a physical object in the world. When the same experience functions in another context, we call it a thought in someone's mind. The dualism of mind and matter is not fundamental, but emerges from different functional arrangements of experience. Consider your perception of a room as an example of how this works according to James's analysis. That perception belongs both to your biography as a mental event and to the room's history as a physical fact. As mental, it connects with your other thoughts, your memories, your intentions, and your personal history. As physical, it connects with the room's other features, its location, its physical causes and effects. The experience itself is one thing that participates in two different causal and functional networks simultaneously. There is no numerically distinct mental copy of the room, in addition to the physical room itself. James called this view the thesis that thoughts and things are made of one and the same primordial stuff. That stuff is pure experience, and what we call mind and matter are different arrangements of it. Bertrand Russell explicitly adopted this view in his analysis of mind and called it neutral monism. Russell credited James with originating the doctrine, though he developed it in his own somewhat different directions. Neutral monism influenced subsequent philosophy of mind, including some versions of functionalism and process philosophy. James's pure experience doctrine contributed to dissolving the sharp Cartesian split between mental and physical realms. The theory solves or dissolves several traditional philosophical problems about mind and body. How can immaterial mind causally interact with material body if they are utterly different substances? This problem disappears if mind and body are not different substances but different arrangements of one stuff. How can mental representations correspond to or picture physical reality if they are made of different materials? This problem disappears if representation is a functional relation within experience rather than a correspondence across substances. Pure experience metaphysics eliminates the gaps that dualist ontology opens and then struggles to bridge. The view also connects to James's radical empiricism and its emphasis on directly experienced relations. If relations are real parts of experience, then experiences can be connected without requiring a connecting substance. Physical objects are systems of experiences connected by physical causal relations, experienced as such. Minds are systems of experiences connected by psychological relations like memory and personal ownership. Neither physical nor mental systems require mysterious substances underlying the experience relations that constitute them. The world is a web of pure experiences related in various ways without hidden substrata beneath the web. Critics objected that pure experience is too vague a concept to do the philosophical work James assigns it. What exactly is this stuff that is neither mental nor physical, but can become either through relations? James acknowledged the concept is difficult and never provided a fully satisfactory explicit characterization. He was still working on the theory when he died in 1910, leaving it incomplete and somewhat obscure. But the basic insight that mind-body dualism creates unnecessary problems remains influential and important. Contemporary philosophy of mind continues struggling with issues James addressed through pure experience metaphysics. Part 14. The Will to Believe. Faith under Uncertainty. In 1896, James delivered a lecture called The Will to Believe, defending a right to religious faith. The essay became one of his most famous and most controversial works, generating debate that continues today. James argued that under certain specifiable conditions, it is permissible to believe without sufficient evidence. This claim directly challenged the evidentialist position articulated by William Clifford in a famous earlier essay. Clifford had declared it wrong always everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. James called this position too restrictive, and argued it would paralyze us in situations requiring commitment. James specified precise conditions under which belief without decisive evidence becomes legitimate. The option to believe must be living, meaning both alternatives are genuinely possible for the person choosing. A living option connects with your existing beliefs, values and dispositions, making it a real candidate for belief. An option to believe in the Mahdi would not be living for most Western readers because it connects with nothing in their worldview. But an option to believe in God might be living because it connects with experiences, values and hopes already present. The first condition restricts the will to believe to options that already have some psychological grip on us. The option must also be forced, meaning there is no way to avoid choosing between the alternatives available. If you can remain neutral without practical consequences, then suspending judgment is the rational course. But some choices do not permit neutrality, because refusing to choose amounts to choosing one alternative effectively. If you must act now, and the two alternatives require different actions, suspending judgment is not really an option. You effectively choose by default if you do not actively choose, so genuine neutrality is impossible in such cases. The practical necessity of commitment forces you to decide even though evidence does not decide for you. The option must also be momentous rather than trivial in its consequences for your life and projects. When nothing important hangs on the choice, you can afford to wait for evidence without significant loss. But when the stakes are high and the opportunity may not recur, waiting becomes costly or impossible. Religious belief often involves such momentous stakes concerning meaning, morality, and ultimate human purposes. The potential gains from believing truly and the potential losses from missing truth justify risking belief under uncertainty. Trivial questions do not warrant exercising the will to believe because nothing significant is lost by waiting. When all three conditions are met, James argued we have the right to believe based on what he called passional grounds. Our willing nature lawfully may and sometimes must decide options that intellect alone cannot resolve. This is not wishful thinking or arbitrary choice, but recognition that some decisions cannot wait for adequate evidence. The scientific ideal of suspending judgment until evidence compels assent does not apply to all domains equally. Personal relationships, moral commitments, and religious faith involve self-verifying elements that pure evidence-gathering cannot capture. Believing in someone's goodness may help bring about that goodness through your trust and engagement. James distinguished his position from both dogmatism and skeptical agnosticism about religious questions. The dogmatist claims to know religious truths with certainty through revelation, authority, or metaphysical proof. James did not claim certainty, but only the right to believe when certainty is unavailable and commitment necessary. The skeptical agnostic refuses all religious commitment until evidence compels assent that may never come. James argued that this refusal is itself a choice with consequences, not a neutral stance above the fray. Choosing not to believe in God has different practical consequences than believing, so neutrality is illusory. Critics accuse James of licensing wishful thinking and rationalizing belief in whatever makes you feel good. If we can believe without evidence, what stops people from believing harmful nonsense that happens to comfort them? James responded that the conditions he specified are severe and rule out most comfortable delusions effectively. The option must be living, forced, and momentous, which eliminates arbitrary or obviously false beliefs immediately. A belief that clashes with your other beliefs or with ongoing experience fails to meet the living condition. The will to believe is not permission to believe anything you want, but a limited right under specific constraints. The essay also argued that faith can be self-verifying in ways that purely evidential belief cannot be. If you believe the universe is friendly to human purposes, you may act in ways that make it friendlier effectively. Your faith contributes to creating the conditions that verify it through your transformed behavior and engagement. Purely passive observation cannot access truths that require participatory engagement to become available or real. James thought religious truths might be among those requiring active commitment before they become experientially accessible. The will to believe opens possibilities that skeptical waiting would foreclose by refusing the necessary engagement. Part 15. Varieties of Religious Experience. Healthy Minds and Sick Souls. In 1902, James delivered his Gifford Lectures at the University of Edinburgh on natural religion. These lectures became the Varieties of Religious Experience, his most widely read book still in print today. James approached religion not as a theologian or believer defending doctrine, but as a psychologist studying phenomena. He focused on personal religious experience rather than institutional religion, creeds, or ecclesiastical organization. The feelings, acts, and experiences of individuals in their solitude as they stand in relation to the divine interested him. Churches and theologies are secondary formations built upon these primary personal experiences afterward. James gathered hundreds of first-person accounts of religious experiences from autobiographies, letters, and correspondence. He treated these reports as data requiring explanation rather than delusions requiring dismissal or debunking. His method was empirical, examining what people actually report experiencing rather than what they should experience theoretically. This phenomenological approach influenced subsequent psychology of religion and religious studies as academic disciplines. James legitimized studying religious experience scientifically without reducing it to pathology or explaining it away reductively. He took seriously what religious people say happens to them even when he could not fully explain how or why. James distinguished two fundamental religious temperaments he called healthy-minded and sick-souled personalities. Healthy-minded people naturally see the world as good and experience life as fundamentally positive and meaningful. They do not dwell on evil, suffering, or death, but focus on growth, joy, and constructive engagement with existence. Their religion emphasizes divine goodness, cosmic harmony, and the natural compatibility of human and divine purposes. Liberal Christianity, Transcendentalism, and mind-cure movements exemplify healthy-minded religious orientations in James's analysis. These people need only to be born once, because they never experience a fundamental rupture requiring radical conversion. Sick souls experience the world very differently, perceiving evil and suffering as fundamental features of existence. They cannot ignore or minimize the darkness in life through optimistic focusing on positive aspects alone. Death, sin, meaninglessness, and cosmic indifference haunt them and demand acknowledgement before any religious resolution. Their path to religious peace requires confronting evil directly and finding transformation through crisis and conversion. They must be born twice, first into natural life and then into spiritual life through a transformative breakthrough experience. Augustine, Luther, Tolstoy, and Bunyan exemplify this twice-born religious pattern in James's extensive analysis. James clearly found the sick soul pattern more profound and ultimately more adequate to reality's complexity. Healthy-mindedness works only by systematically ignoring aspects of existence that refuse to remain ignored forever. Eventually, suffering, loss, or death breaks through the optimistic defenses and demands acknowledgement and integration. The sick soul confronts these realities from the start and therefore achieves a more complete and stable resolution. Their hard-won peace encompasses evil rather than excluding it, and therefore proves more durable under pressure. The twice-born achieve what James called a higher synthesis, including both good and evil in their worldview. The book extensively documents conversion experiences where divided selves become unified through sudden or gradual transformation. Conversion involves the previously peripheral ideas and energies moving to the center of consciousness and identity. What was cold becomes hot. What was distant becomes near. What was theoretical becomes vividly real and motivating. The self that emerges from conversion feels continuous with the old self, but fundamentally reoriented and transformed. James analyzed conversion psychologically without denying that it might also involve genuine contact with transcendent realities. He left open whether divine action or purely natural processes produce the dramatic changes converts report experiencing. James identified saintliness as the characteristic fruit of genuine religious experience across traditions and cultures. Saints exhibit certain predictable traits, including a sense of living in a wider life than selfish worldly interests. They feel continuous with an ideal power, a friendly presence supporting their efforts toward goodness and truth. This produces elation, freedom, and a shifting of emotional center away from self-concern toward broader purposes. Saints exhibit charity, purity, asceticism, and strength of soul flowing from their transformed relationship with ultimate reality. James evaluated saintliness pragmatically, asking whether it produces good fruits in the lives of saints and communities. The pragmatic evaluation of saintliness revealed both positive and negative results depending on circumstances and degree. Moderate saintliness produces genuine goods, including compassion, integrity, and beneficial influence on surrounding communities. Extreme saintliness can become impractical, fanatical, or even harmful when carried beyond appropriate limits. Excessive asceticism damages health. Excessive purity becomes intolerant. Excessive charity enables parasites and manipulators. James concluded that saintliness requires tempering by worldly wisdom to produce optimal results in actual practice. The highest religious development combines spiritual depth with practical intelligence about how the world actually works. Part 16. Mysticism, 4 marks and epistemological status. James devoted 2 lectures in the Varieties to analysing mystical states of consciousness systematically. He identified 4 marks that distinguish mystical experiences from ordinary states of awareness and cognition. These marks appear across religious traditions and cultures, suggesting a common underlying phenomenon beneath doctrinal differences. Understanding mysticism required identifying its essential features rather than focusing on specific theological interpretations. James approached mysticism as a psychologist, examining experiences rather than as a metaphysician pronouncing on their ultimate truth. This empirical approach allowed him to take mysticism seriously without committing to any particular religious framework. The first mark of mystical states is ineffability, the impossibility of adequately describing them in ordinary language. Mystics consistently report that their experiences cannot be communicated to those who have not had similar experiences. The states must be directly experienced to be understood because words fail to capture their essential quality completely. This ineffability resembles the difficulty of describing colours to someone born blind or music to someone born deaf. Mystical knowledge is experiential rather than propositional, known through acquaintance rather than through description alone. James took this consistent report of ineffability as evidence that mystical states are genuinely distinctive psychological phenomena. The second mark is noetic quality, the sense that mystical states reveal deep truths about reality. Despite their ineffability, mystical experiences feel like states of knowledge and insight, not mere emotional episodes. Mystics report illuminations, revelations, and disclosures full of significance and importance for understanding existence. These insights carry authority and conviction that persists long after the experience itself has faded from consciousness. The mystic feels they have learned something profound, even if they cannot articulate exactly what they have learned. James accepted that mystical states feel noetic without committing to whether they actually convey genuine metaphysical knowledge. The third mark is transiency, the fact that mystical states cannot be sustained for long periods of time. Most mystical experiences last between a few minutes and an hour or 2 at maximum duration. When they fade, the content can be imperfectly recalled, but the distinctive quality cannot be fully reproduced at will. This distinguishes mystical states from altered states produced by drugs or mental illness, which may persist much longer. The transient suggests that mystical consciousness is an exceptional condition the mind cannot maintain continuously. Like peak experiences generally, mystical states punctuate ordinary consciousness without replacing it permanently. The fourth mark is passivity, the sense that one's own will is suspended and held by a superior power. Although various preliminary practices may help induce mystical states, once they occur, the mystic feels grasped rather than grasping. The experience happens to the mystic rather than being produced by deliberate effort or mental activity. This passivity connects mystical experience to other phenomena like hypnotic trance, mediumship, and prophetic inspiration. In all these states, the normal sense of active agency gives way to a sense of being used or spoken through. James noted that such passive states often leave profound effects on the inner life, even after they pass. James examined the epistemological status of mystical states carefully without committing to strong conclusions either way. Do mystical experiences provide genuine knowledge about transcendent realities, or merely reveal facts about brain chemistry? James argued that mystical states have full authority over the individuals who experience them directly and immediately. The mystic is entitled to believe what the experience seems to reveal, given its overwhelming character and noetic quality. Others who have not had such experiences are under no obligation to accept the mystic's testimony as authoritative. But neither can non-mystics simply dismiss mystical claims as worthless, since they come from a form of experience they lack. The existence of mystical states shows that ordinary waking consciousness is only one type of consciousness among others. Parted from it by the filmist of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different in character. No account of reality that ignores these other forms of consciousness can be considered complete or final. Even if mystical states reveal nothing about external metaphysical reality, they reveal something about human consciousness itself. They show that the mind can function in radically different modes than those we employ in everyday practical affairs. Any adequate philosophy must acknowledge and account for these remarkable capacities of human consciousness somehow. James also noted that mystical states across different traditions converge on certain common themes despite doctrinal differences. They typically involve a sense of unity, overcoming the separation between self and world or self and ultimate reality. They often include a sense of timelessness, transcending the ordinary flow of past, present and future. They frequently involve positive affect, feelings of peace, joy, blessedness and love pervading the experience. This convergence across cultures and traditions suggests that mystical experience taps into something genuinely universal in human nature. The differences in interpretation may reflect cultural conditioning, while the underlying experience remains fundamentally similar. Part 17. Free Will and the Dilemma of Determinism. James's commitment to free will emerged from his personal crisis and remained central throughout his philosophical career. In 1884, he delivered a lecture called The Dilemma of Determinism that set terms for subsequent debates. He distinguished hard determinism, soft determinism or compatibilism, and indeterminism or libertarian free will clearly. Hard determinism holds that all events, including human choices, are necessitated by prior causes, leaving no genuine alternatives. Soft determinism holds that freedom is compatible with determinism if actions flow from one's own desires and character. Indeterminism holds that some events, including human choices, are genuinely undetermined and could have been otherwise. James rejected hard determinism primarily on moral and existential rather than purely metaphysical grounds. If everything is determined, then regret for past actions and hope for better future actions become irrational responses. Regret implies that something should not have happened, but in a determined universe, everything happens necessarily. How can we coherently regret what could not have been otherwise given the antecedent conditions that caused it? Hard determinism makes moral judgments about what ought to be mere expressions of how we happen to feel mechanically. James found this implication intolerable because it evacuates moral life of genuine significance and rational grounding. He called this the dilemma of determinism because it forces a choice between two unacceptable alternatives. Either we accept that regret is irrational in a determined universe, or we embrace a pessimism that finds existence fundamentally bad. If we regret bad actions that were determined to happen, we effectively regret the universe that made them inevitable. This cosmic regret leads to pessimism about existence as a whole, rather than targeted moral criticism of particular actions. The determinist who feels regret must either abandon the feeling or expand it into world-condemning pessimism. James found neither option acceptable and therefore rejected the determinism that generates this dilemma. James also rejected soft determinism or compatibilism as an evasion rather than a genuine solution to the problem. Compatibilists define freedom as action, flowing from one's own desires and character without external constraint. On this view, you act freely when you do what you want, even if your wants are themselves determined by prior causes. James called this a quagmire of evasion because it changes the subject rather than addressing the real issue. The question is not whether actions flow from desires, but whether the desires themselves could have been different. Compatibilist freedom is not the freedom to have done otherwise that moral responsibility seems to require genuinely. James embraced indeterminism, the view that some events, including human choices, are genuinely open until they occur. The future contains real possibilities not yet determined by the present, leaving room for novelty and genuine alternatives. When we face a choice, multiple outcomes are genuinely possible, and our decision actualizes one of several real options. This makes regret rational, because the regretted action really could have been avoided through different choice. It makes hope rational because the future really is open to improvement through our efforts and decisions. Indeterminism saves moral life by providing the metaphysical space for genuine responsibility, desert, and aspiration. James admitted that indeterminism cannot be proven through scientific evidence or logical argument conclusively. Science reveals regularities and correlations, but cannot demonstrate that those regularities are absolutely necessary throughout nature. The same evidence is compatible with determinism that we have not yet discovered, and indeterminism actually operating. We cannot design an experiment to prove that an event was undetermined, rather than determined by unknown factors. James therefore treated indeterminism as a postulate or assumption justified by its consequences rather than its evidence. Believing in free will works better than believing in determinism for sustaining meaningful moral and practical life. The pragmatic justification for believing in free will connects back to James's crisis and his first act of free will. His choice to believe in free will was justified by its consequences in enabling him to escape depression and paralysis. The belief made a practical difference by making action and moral striving feel meaningful and worthwhile again. This does not prove that free will exists, but it justifies believing in it, given the forced and momentous character of the choice. We cannot avoid choosing, because suspending judgment about free will still has consequences for how we live and act. James exercised his will to believe on the question of whether he had a will, creating a self-validating commitment. Part 18. Pluralism against absolute idealism, the block universe. Throughout his career, James battled absolute idealism, the dominant academic philosophy of his era in America and Britain. Absolute idealists like F. H. Bradley and Josiah Royce argued that reality is ultimately one unified whole or absolute mind. All apparent multiplicity, change, and imperfection are appearances within this single comprehensive spiritual reality. The Absolute knows all truth eternally and timelessly in a complete unified vision, transcending partial finite perspectives. James found this vision intellectually impressive, but practically and emotionally suffocating in its implications. He called the absolutely unified reality the block universe and devoted his pluralism to opposing it systematically. The block universe eliminates genuine novelty because everything that happens is eternally present in the Absolute's knowledge. The future is already fixed in the timeless vision that encompasses past, present, and future simultaneously. Nothing genuinely new can emerge because the whole story is already complete from the eternal perspective. Time becomes an illusion of finite minds rather than a real dimension in which genuine change occurs. James found this implication fatal to any meaningful conception of human agency, creativity, and moral endeavor. If the future is already determined in eternal vision, our choices cannot make any real difference to how things go. The block universe also eliminates genuine evil by absorbing it into a whole that is ultimately perfect and harmonious. From the Absolute's perspective, every apparent evil contributes necessarily to the perfection of the total system. Suffering and wickedness are required for the completeness of the cosmic design, and therefore justified ultimately. This means that moral struggle against evil is ultimately pointless, since evil serves a necessary cosmic function. James found this conclusion morally monstrous, a rationalization of suffering that insults those who actually suffer. Taking evil seriously requires treating it as genuinely bad rather than secretly good from a higher perspective. James offered pluralism as the alternative, holding that reality is genuinely multiple rather than secretly unified. The universe is more like a collection of loose threads than a single woven tapestry with every part connected to every other. Different parts of reality have external relations to each other rather than internal relations constituting their very essence. This means that you can understand parts without understanding the whole, because parts have genuine independence. The universe grows through time rather than existing complete for all eternity in timeless finished perfection. Novelty is real because the future is genuinely open and not already contained in present or past. James used vivid imagery to contrast the pluralistic and absolutist visions of reality graphically. The absolutist universe is like an aquarium, a crystal globe in which goldfish swim in transparent interconnection. Every part is visible from every other part, and the whole forms a closed, unified totality completely. The pluralist universe is more like a jungle or a mess, with parts connected to near neighbours but not to distant regions. Some connections are tight and intimate, while others are loose, external, or entirely absent between distant parts. The pluralist universe is ragged at the edges, incomplete, growing, and genuinely open to multiple possible futures. Pluralism has implications for how we understand truth, knowledge, and the human cognitive situation fundamentally. If reality is genuinely plural, then no single perspective can capture the whole truth about everything simultaneously. Different perspectives reveal different aspects of reality without any perspective being complete or final. This epistemological pluralism connects to James's emphasis on the perspectival character of all human knowledge. We always know from somewhere, from a particular standpoint that illuminates some features while obscuring others inevitably. Humility about our cognitive limitations follows from recognizing that no finite knower can achieve the Absolute's vision. Pluralism also connects to democracy and tolerance in social and political life, according to James's vision. If reality is genuinely multiple, then different individuals and communities may have legitimate access to different truths. No single authority can claim to possess the complete truth that entitles them to override all other perspectives. Dialogue, negotiation, and mutual learning become appropriate responses to disagreement rather than coerced uniformity. James's pluralism has been interpreted as philosophical support for liberal democratic values and practices. The political implications were not accidental, but flowed from his deepest metaphysical convictions about reality's nature. Part 19. Meliorism. The world is improvable. James positioned his philosophy between optimism and pessimism with a view he called meliorism. Optimism holds that the world is fundamentally good and will necessarily turn out well in the end. This view requires ignoring or explaining away genuine evil and suffering that obviously exist in experience. Pessimism holds that the world is fundamentally bad and things will necessarily remain terrible or get worse. This view requires ignoring or explaining away genuine goods and possibilities for improvement that also exist. Both optimism and pessimism claim more certainty about the world's ultimate character than evidence warrants legitimately. Meliorism holds that the world is genuinely improvable, though improvement is neither guaranteed nor impossible. Whether things get better depends on what we do, making human effort genuinely consequential for outcomes. The future is not fixed, but open, capable of becoming better or worse depending on how events unfold. This view takes both good and evil seriously, without claiming that either necessarily triumphs in the end. It preserves the rational basis for moral effort that optimism and pessimism both undermine in different ways. If improvement is guaranteed, effort is unnecessary. If improvement is impossible, effort is futile. Meliorism makes effort matter. Meliorism connects directly to James's indeterminist metaphysics and his rejection of the block universe. If the future is genuinely open and undetermined, then what we do can genuinely influence how things turn out. Our choices contribute to making the world better or worse, rather than merely enacting a predetermined script. The universe is still in the making, rather than finished from all eternity, and we participate in that making. This participatory role gives human life genuine significance that neither optimism nor pessimism can provide. We are co-creators of reality rather than spectators watching a show whose outcome is already fixed. James connected Meliorism to religious faith by suggesting that God might also be a meliorist, working toward improvement. Perhaps God is not omnipotent and omniscient, but a finite being struggling alongside us against evil and limitation. This finite God needs our help to achieve good outcomes rather than guaranteeing those outcomes unilaterally. Such a God would be worthy of worship not as an all-powerful monarch, but as a noble ally in moral struggle. James found this finite God more religiously satisfying than the absolute of idealist philosophy. A struggling God who might fail connects better with the human moral situation than a God for whom everything is already perfect. The meliorist perspective influenced James's approach to social and political questions throughout his career. He supported reform movements aiming to improve social conditions without claiming inevitable progress toward utopia. The reforms might succeed or fail depending on effort, intelligence, and circumstances that we cannot fully control. This realistic hopefulness seemed to James more practically useful than grandiose revolutionary visions or despairing quietism. We should work for improvement while recognizing that improvement requires work and is not automatically coming. Meliorism is the appropriate attitude for agents genuinely capable of making a difference in an uncertain world. James's final lecture, The Moral Equivalent of War, delivered at Stanford in 1906, exemplifies meliorist thinking. He asked how societies could retain the virtues that war produces: courage, discipline, and sacrifice, without actual warfare. His answer was conscripting youth for peaceful struggle against nature and social problems requiring similar virtues. This proposal aimed to improve society by channeling martial energies into constructive rather than destructive activities. The improvement was not guaranteed, but possible through intelligent social design and committed human effort. James offered a practical program rather than utopian vision or despairing acceptance of inevitable human violence. Meliorism has remained influential in American philosophy and culture as a distinctively Jamesian contribution. John Dewey developed meliorist themes extensively in his educational philosophy and social theory throughout his career. Contemporary pragmatists like Richard Rorty and Cornel West continue working within a broadly meliorist framework today. The view resonates with American cultural tendencies toward optimism about improvement tempered by practical realism. It provides philosophical grounding for social reform movements that aim to make things better without claiming perfection. Meliorism remains James's practical answer to the question of how we should orient ourselves toward an uncertain future. Part 20. Influence on Phenomenology. Husserl and Embodied Cognition. James's influence on Edmund Husserl, the founder of Phenomenology, was direct, substantial, and openly acknowledged. Husserl read The Principles of Psychology carefully and found in it anticipations of his own phenomenological method. James's descriptions of consciousness attended to the actual structure of experience before imposing theoretical frameworks. This descriptive approach aimed to capture how things appear rather than explaining them through causal mechanisms. Husserl recognized a kindred spirit in James's attempt to describe the stream of thought without presupposing dualist metaphysics. The phenomenological motto, to return to the things themselves, echoes James's empirical fidelity to actual experience. James's concept of the fringe directly influenced Husserl's notion of the horizon surrounding every intentional act. Every conscious experience has a focal center surrounded by a halo of implicit meanings, possibilities, and connections. This horizon is not explicitly thought, but shapes the meaning of what is explicitly present in consciousness. Husserl developed this insight systematically in ways James only sketched, but the origin in James is clear. The structure of consciousness includes more than what is focally attended to at any given moment always. Meaning arises from this contextual surround, as much as from the explicitly present content of awareness. James's treatment of the body in relation to consciousness also anticipated phenomenological themes about embodiment. He insisted that the spiritual self, when introspected, reveals bodily feelings, especially in the head and chest regions. Mental effort feels like muscular strain, emotions feel like visceral disturbances, attention feels like ocular adjustment. This emphasis on bodily feeling as constitutive of mental states anticipates embodied cognition research a century later. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenologist of embodiment, drew on James's insights about bodily consciousness extensively. The body is not merely a physical object we possess, but the lived medium through which we experience the world. James's radical empiricism also influenced phenomenological approaches to perception and reality. His insistence that relations are directly experienced parallels phenomenological claims about the intentional structure of experience. We do not experience bare sensory data and then add meaning. Experience comes already meaningful and relational from the start. This shared anti-atomism connects Jamesian psychology with Husserlian phenomenology at a deep structural level. Both traditions reject building up experience from meaningless elements combined by association or synthesis afterward. Experience is inherently structured, meaningful, and connected rather than assembled from disconnected atomic bits. Contemporary embodied cognition research in cognitive science draws on both Jamesian and phenomenological resources. Researchers argue that cognition is not abstract symbol manipulation, but embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended. The body's sensoromotor capacities shape and constrain cognitive processes rather than merely executing mental commands. Emotions involve bodily states constitutively, as James argued, rather than merely expressing pre-existing mental states. Perception involves active bodily exploration of the environment rather than passive reception of sensory inputs. These contemporary approaches continue the Jamesian and phenomenological emphasis on embodied, engaged experience. The phenomenological tradition also developed James's insights about time consciousness and the specious present. Husserl's analysis of internal time consciousness elaborates how present experience includes retention of the just past and pretension toward the imminent future. This structure of temporal thickness, allowing the experience of succession and change, comes directly from James's analysis. Husserl acknowledged James's priority while developing the ideas with greater systematic rigour and technical precision. The phenomenology of time remains indebted to James's initial recognition that we experience duration directly, not through inference. Time consciousness became a central topic in phenomenology because James had shown its importance for understanding experience. Part 21. Influence on Analytic Philosophy. Russell, Wittgenstein, and beyond. James's influence extended into analytic philosophy despite the common perception that pragmatism and analysis are opposed. Bertrand Russell explicitly adopted James's doctrine of pure experience and developed it into his neutral monism. Russell's analysis of mind argues that mind and matter are constructed from elements that are intrinsically neither mental nor physical. He credited James with originating this view and considered it a major contribution to solving the mind-body problem. Russell disagreed with James about truth and meaning, but found his metaphysics of experience genuinely illuminating. The analytic tradition absorbed Jamesian ideas even while criticizing other aspects of pragmatist philosophy vigorously. Ludwig Wittgenstein also drew on James's principles in ways scholars have increasingly documented and analyzed. Wittgenstein's discussions of understanding, meaning, and rule-following show clear connections to James's psychological analyses. James's observation that we cannot catch transitive mental states by introspection influenced Wittgenstein's skepticism about inner mental objects. The attempt to introspect understanding or intending transforms the state and fails to capture it in its natural operation. Wittgenstein cited James on the absence of a distinctive will act when we perform voluntary movements normally. We do not find an act of willing that causes the movement. We simply move, and the willing is in the moving itself. James's critique of introspectionism also anticipated arguments that became central in analytic philosophy of mind later. The idea that we have privileged, infallible access to our own mental states came under sustained criticism in both traditions. James showed that introspection is difficult, fallible, and often transforms what it tries to observe directly. This fallibilism about self-knowledge connected with later analytic arguments against Cartesian privileged access doctrines. Gilbert Ryle's critique of the ghost in the machine shares James's suspicion of mental entities posited beyond observable behaviour. The overlap between pragmatist and analytic criticisms of Cartesian mentalism is substantial though not complete. James's pragmatic theory of meaning also has connections to verificationism developed by the Vienna Circle logical positivists. Both views tie meaning to experiential or observational consequences rather than to abstract correspondence relations alone. The pragmatic maxim asks what experiential differences would result from a concept being true or false. The verification principle asks what observations would confirm or disconfirm a statement claiming factual content. Both principles were used to criticize traditional metaphysics as meaningless when it made no experiential difference. The logical positivists were hostile to pragmatism officially, but shared some of its anti-metaphysical motivations. Later, analytic philosophers like W. V. O. Quine continued pragmatist themes while working within analytic frameworks officially. Quine's holism about belief systems echoes James's claim that new beliefs must fit with our existing stock of beliefs. His naturalism about epistemology parallels James's insistence that philosophy cannot float free of empirical psychology. Quine acknowledged Dewey as an influence more than James, but the pragmatist lineage runs through both figures clearly. Richard Rorty made the James-Dewey pragmatist tradition central to his neo-pragmatist project in analytic philosophy. Hilary Putnam also drew extensively on James in developing his pragmatic realism and his critique of metaphysical realism. The contemporary analytic literature on truth continues engaging with James's pragmatic theory despite persistent criticisms. Most analytic philosophers reject the pragmatic theory but find it necessary to address and refute in their own accounts. The debate between correspondence, coherence, and pragmatic theories remains unresolved in contemporary philosophy of language. James's formulations were imprecise by later standards, but raised questions that philosophers still struggle to answer definitively. What exactly is the relationship between truth and utility, between belief and action, between meaning and verification? These Jamesian questions remain live issues in analytic philosophy, even when his answers are not accepted. Part 22. Influence on American Thought, Dewey, Rorty, and Public Philosophy. John Dewey was James's most important philosophical heir, developing pragmatism into a comprehensive philosophical system. Dewey studied James's principles as a young philosopher and corresponded with James throughout their overlapping careers. He transformed Jamesian functionalism into his own instrumentalism, emphasizing inquiry as problem-solving activity. Dewey's focus on education, democracy and social reform extended James's practical orientation into systematic social philosophy. Where James wrote for individual readers seeking personal meaning, Dewey addressed collective problems requiring institutional solutions. Together, they established pragmatism as the distinctively American contribution to world philosophy in the 20th century. Dewey's educational philosophy drew directly on James's functionalist psychology and its emphasis on learning through doing. Education should not transmit fixed knowledge, but develop capacities for intelligent inquiry and problem-solving. Students learn by engaging with genuine problems rather than memorizing information disconnected from lived experience. This progressive education movement transformed American schooling and remains influential, though controversial today. James's talks to teachers anticipated Dewey's more systematic educational writings and shared their practical orientation. Both believed psychology should serve human flourishing rather than merely accumulating theoretical knowledge about mind. Dewey also developed James's Meliorism into a comprehensive social philosophy emphasizing experimental reform. Social problems should be approached like scientific problems, through hypothesis formation, testing, and revision based on results. Democracy is not just a political system, but a way of life involving shared inquiry and collective problem-solving. This experimentalist approach to social questions influenced American liberalism throughout the 20th century substantially. Dewey's public philosophy made pragmatism relevant to policy debates about education, economics, and political organization. He brought James's philosophical insights into engagement with the pressing social problems of industrial democracy Richard Rorty revived pragmatism in the late 20th century after a period of relative neglect in American philosophy. His Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature criticized representationalist epistemology using arguments with clear Jamesian resonances. Rorty rejected the idea that mind mirrors nature and that philosophy's job is perfecting that mirroring relation. He substituted conversation and solidarity for correspondence and objectivity as the goals of intellectual life. This neo-pragmatism generated enormous controversy, but also renewed interest in the classical pragmatist tradition significantly. Rorty acknowledged James as a major influence alongside Dewey and the later Wittgenstein explicitly. Hilary Putnam offered another influential contemporary development of pragmatist themes in analytic philosophy. His pragmatic realism tried to preserve common-sense realism while accepting pragmatist insights about meaning and truth. Putnam argued that we cannot make sense of a God's-eye view of reality independent of all conceptual schemes. But we can still meaningfully talk about truth and objectivity within our human perspective on things practically. This middle path between metaphysical realism and relativism echoes James's own attempts at philosophical balance. Putnam wrote extensively about James and helped establish him as a serious philosopher, not just a popularizer. Cornel West developed pragmatism in directions engaging race, religion, and democratic struggle in American society. His prophetic pragmatism combines James's emphasis on individual experience with attention to systemic injustice and collective action. West finds in pragmatism resources for a politically engaged philosophy that takes suffering seriously while maintaining hope. The Meliorist conviction that things can get better through effort connects pragmatism to social movements for justice. West's work shows that pragmatism remains generative for addressing contemporary problems, not just of historical interest. The tradition James founded continues developing in new directions responsive to changing circumstances and concerns. Part 23. Influence on Neuroscience and Cognitive Science. James anticipated neuroscientific approaches to mind by insisting on the intimate connection between psychology and physiology. He established the first psychology laboratory in America and studied brain localization research seriously throughout his career. The Principles of Psychology integrates physiological and psychological levels of analysis more thoroughly than most subsequent textbooks. James believed that understanding mind requires understanding brain, without reducing mind to brain entirely or ignoring brain. This methodological stance remains the dominant approach in contemporary cognitive neuroscience and psychology of mind. We study both behavior and brain seeking to understand how neural processes relate to psychological phenomena. Antonio Damasio's work on emotion and decision-making draws explicitly and extensively on James's theoretical framework. Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis builds directly on the James-Lange theory's claim that emotions involve bodily states constitutively. Patients with damage to brain regions that represent bodily states show impaired emotional experience and poor decision-making. This supports James's contention that emotions are not disembodied mental states, but involve the whole organism's physiology. Damasio titled one of his books Descartes' Error, echoing James's lifelong opposition to Cartesian mind-body dualism. Contemporary affective neuroscience vindicates James's intuition that body and emotion are deeply intertwined causally. Research on consciousness in neuroscience also engages with James's phenomenological descriptions of mental life. The stream of consciousness concept informs research on the continuity and discontinuity of conscious experience. Studies of attention confirm James's claims about the selective, limited, and effortful character of conscious processing. Inattentional blindness and change blindness demonstrate that consciousness requires attention, as James argued extensively. The binding problem of how unified experience arises from distributed neural processing echoes James's concerns about unity of consciousness. Neuroscientists study the same phenomena James described using different methods, but often reaching compatible conclusions. Predictive processing frameworks in cognitive science also have Jamesian resonances worth noting explicitly. These frameworks propose that the brain continuously generates predictions about incoming sensory input based on prior experience. Perception involves matching predictions against actual input and updating models when predictions fail or misfire. This active, constructive view of perception echoes James's emphasis on the selective, purposive character of consciousness. We do not passively receive sensory data, but actively anticipate and interpret based on expectations and goals constantly. The brain is not a mirror of nature, but an active predictor trying to minimize surprise and optimize action. Research on habit and automaticity confirms James's psychological analysis of how behaviors become automatic through repetition. Neuroscience has identified the basal ganglia as crucial for habit formation and the transition from effortful to automatic behavior. The distinction between explicit and implicit memory systems corresponds roughly to James's primary and secondary memory distinction. Working memory research has elaborated the concept of primary memory into a complex system with multiple components. In each case, contemporary cognitive science has refined rather than replaced the basic framework James established initially. His concepts remain generative starting points for empirical research more than a century after he proposed them originally. The embodied cognition movement in cognitive science develops themes central to James's approach to mind and experience. Researchers argue that cognition is grounded in bodily interaction with the environment rather than abstract symbol manipulation alone. Concepts are not amodal symbols, but involve sensorimotor simulations of the experiences they represent mentally. This view echoes James's insistence that even abstract thought involves bodily feelings and motor preparations throughout. Thinking is not separate from acting, but continuous with it, involving preparation for engagement with the world constantly. James would recognize contemporary embodied cognition as developing insights he had articulated in different vocabulary earlier. Part 24. Major Critiques and James's Responses. Charles Sanders. Peirce, who invented pragmatism, became one of James's sharpest critics over what pragmatism meant. Peirce objected that James had loosened the pragmatic maxim from a logical principle to a psychological and personal one. For Peirce, meaning consists in conceivable experimental consequences specifiable in general logical terms precisely. For James, meaning includes any practical consequences, including emotional and personal differences that beliefs make. Peirce found James's extension sloppy and unscientific, reducing pragmatism to a license for wishful thinking and subjectivism. He renamed his own position Pragmatism, hoping the ugly name would protect it from kidnappers like James. James responded that Peirce's restriction was arbitrary and excluded legitimate concerns that beliefs affect beyond laboratory verification. The practical consequences of believing in God or free will are as real as consequences of beliefs about physical objects. Why should pragmatism apply only to scientific and logical questions when all beliefs have practical ramifications for life? James did not deny Peirce's logical pragmatism, but extended it into domains Peirce wanted to exclude artificially. The dispute was never fully resolved, and scholars still debate whether James legitimately developed or illegitimately corrupted Peirce's idea. Both versions of pragmatism have influential defenders in contemporary philosophy, maintaining distinct traditions. Bertrand Russell criticized James's pragmatic theory of truth for conflating truth with utility, which are distinct properties. A belief can be true but useless, like most truths about distant galaxies that make no difference to human life. A belief can be useful but false, like encouraging delusions that help people cope but do not correspond to reality. Russell insisted that truth is correspondence with fact, regardless of whether the correspondence benefits or harms believers. James had run together the question of what truth is with the separate question of what truth is good for, practically. This conflation produced confusion and error that a clearer philosophical analysis could have avoided, according to Russell. James responded that truth and utility are not identical, but that we cannot understand truth without considering how truth functions. Correspondence with reality is not a self-explanatory notion, but requires pragmatic analysis to become genuinely meaningful. What does it mean for an idea to correspond to a fact, except that the idea works in relating us to that fact successfully? Mere passive mirroring cannot constitute the cognitive relation that knowledge involves between mind and world. James did not deny correspondence, but tried to explain what correspondence amounts to in experiential terms practically. The debate concerns whether pragmatic analysis illuminates or undermines the correspondence notion of truth legitimately. G. E. Moore and other realists criticized James for making truth depend on human interests rather than objective reality. If truth is what works for us, then truth becomes relative to human needs and potentially variable across different situations. But surely 2 + 2 = 4, regardless of whether believing this benefits anyone or serves any practical purpose. Mathematical and logical truths seem completely independent of human interests and practical consequences entirely. James's theory seemed unable to account for the objectivity and necessity that some truths obviously possess intrinsically. The mind independence of mathematical truth posed a serious challenge to any pragmatic or humanistic account. James responded that even mathematical truths work by enabling successful reasoning and prediction of consequences accurately. 2 + 2 = 4 works, because counting by this rule never leads us astray in our dealings with discrete objects. The apparent necessity of mathematical truth reflects its maximal reliability and coherence with all other established truths. We cannot conceive it false because doing so would unravel the entire web of our mathematical and logical commitments. The objectivity of mathematics is practical objectivity, the impossibility of making it fail or finding exceptions to it anywhere. This response did not satisfy realist critics who wanted truth grounded in reality, independent of all human perspective. Part 25. Common Misconceptions. What people get wrong. The most common misconception about James is that pragmatism means truth is whatever you want to believe or find convenient. This vulgar pragmatism would make wishful thinking legitimate and eliminate any objective constraints on belief formation. James explicitly rejected this interpretation and spent years clarifying that working means working comprehensively and long-term. A belief that clashes with experience or other established beliefs does not work and therefore fails the pragmatic test. The constraints on truth are severe even if they are experiential rather than transcendental in character and formulation. James complained bitterly that critics kept attacking a position he never held and had explicitly disavowed repeatedly. A related misconception is that pragmatism entails relativism, the view that truth varies across individuals or cultures arbitrarily. If truth is what works and different things work for different people, then truth becomes subjective and relative completely. James did emphasize the human contribution to truth and the perspectival character of all knowledge claims legitimately. But he did not conclude that anything goes or that all perspectives are equally valid regardless of their fit with reality. Some beliefs work better than others, and the comparison is possible even if no belief achieves absolute God's-eye objectivity. Pragmatism is fallibilist, holding that all beliefs are revisable, but fallibilism is not relativism about truth claims. Another misconception is that James's will to believe doctrine permits believing anything you want on faith without evidence. James specified strict conditions under which belief without sufficient evidence becomes legitimate and permissible at all. The option must be living, forced, and momentous, and it must be genuinely undecidable by available evidence currently. These conditions exclude most beliefs and apply only to certain existential, moral, and religious questions specifically. You cannot invoke the will to believe to justify believing in Santa Claus or flat Earth or anything your evidence excludes. James was defending a limited right under specific constraints, not a general license for credulity or self-deception. Some readers misconceive James as anti-scientific because he defended religious belief and criticized scientific materialism. In fact, James was trained as a scientist and respected scientific method throughout his career sincerely and deeply. He established psychology as an empirical discipline in America and contributed to its laboratory methodology personally. His criticism targeted scientism, the illegitimate extension of scientific methods beyond their proper domain of application. Science cannot answer all meaningful questions, and pretending it can distorts both science and the questions it cannot address. James defended science within its proper limits, while resisting imperialist claims that science exhausts legitimate inquiry. The James-Lange theory is often misconceived as claiming that emotions are nothing but bodily sensations without cognitive content. This reading ignores James's recognition that emotions involve perception of the situation that triggers the bodily response. The bodily response is to a perceived situation, and the emotion includes awareness of that situation as well as bodily feeling. James argued that the bodily feelings constitute the emotional quality, not that cognition plays no role whatsoever. Contemporary interpretations of James recognize the cognitive elements in his theory that earlier critics overlooked or minimized. The theory is more sophisticated than the crude body equals emotion reading that textbooks sometimes present inaccurately. Finally, James is sometimes misconceived as merely a popularizer, rather than a serious original philosopher deserving close study. His accessible writing style and public lectures led academic philosophers to dismiss him as insufficiently rigorous technically. But engagement with his texts reveals careful argumentation, original insights, and sophisticated positions on difficult problems. His influence on Husserl, Russell, Wittgenstein, and Dewey demonstrates that serious philosophers took him seriously intellectually. The principles of psychology and essays in radical empiricism contain philosophy as deep as any produced in his era. James chose to write accessibly, but this choice reflected his values, not his incapacity for technical philosophical work. Part 26. Conclusion. The unity behind the diversity. William James produced an enormous body of work spanning psychology, philosophy, religion, and public affairs over decades. The apparent diversity of topics masks an underlying unity that becomes visible when we understand his fundamental commitments. Everything James wrote flows from his response to the crisis that nearly destroyed him in his late 20s. That crisis taught him that ideas must be evaluated by their consequences for actually living human lives in practice. He learned that determinism kills the will to live, and that believing in freedom can make freedom effective and real. The pragmatic test of truth, the defense of free will, the will to believe all connect back to this foundational experience. The stream of consciousness doctrine reveals mind as continuous, selective, purposive, and personally owned throughout. This description opposes atomistic psychology that fragments experience into discrete elements combined by mechanical association. Functionalism asks what consciousness does rather than what it contains, connecting psychology to biology and practical life. The James-Lange theory locates emotion in bodily experience, dissolving the gap between mind and body at affective levels. Radical empiricism and pure experience extend this dissolution into metaphysics, eliminating substance dualism entirely comprehensively. Throughout, James opposes fragmentation and dualism in favor of continuity, connection, and holistic integration consistently. The will to believe and varieties of religious experience defend the legitimacy of religious faith without demanding certainty. James's God is not the absolute of idealist philosophy, but a finite ally struggling alongside us against evil and limitation. Meliorism holds that the world is improvable through effort, making human action genuinely significant for cosmic outcomes. Pluralism opposes the block universe where everything is already determined eternally and novelty is impossible by definition. These doctrines preserve the conditions for meaningful moral life that James's crisis taught him to value above all else. Without freedom, genuine alternatives and real stakes, life becomes a spectacle rather than a struggle that matters. James's influence extends across philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, religious studies, and American intellectual culture broadly. He shaped phenomenology through Husserl, analytic philosophy through Russell and Wittgenstein, American philosophy through Dewey and Rorty. Contemporary embodied cognition, affective neuroscience, and predictive processing frameworks continue developing his insights productively. His approach to religion established the psychology of religion as a legitimate field of empirical and philosophical inquiry. His pluralism and Meliorism shaped American liberal democratic culture throughout the 20th century substantially. No American philosopher has had broader or more lasting influence across more diverse fields of thought and practice. The deepest lesson from James concerns the relationship between philosophy and life that he insisted could not be severed. Philosophy is not an academic game, but an attempt to find ideas that make life worth living under difficult conditions. Ideas must be tested by their fruits, by what difference they make for how people actually experience and navigate existence. This practical orientation does not reduce philosophy to mere utility, but enriches it with genuine human stakes and significance. James wanted philosophy to matter, and he showed that it can matter when it engages real problems facing real people sincerely. His life and work demonstrate that rigorous thinking and practical relevance are not enemies, but natural allies, ultimately. James died in 1910 at his summer home in New Hampshire after years of declining health and heart problems. He left behind an unfinished systematic philosophy that he compared to an arch built only on one side without completion. But the fragments he left have proved more generative than many completed systems that came before and after his work. His ideas continue stimulating new research, new interpretations, and new applications over a century after his death occurred. William James remains essential reading for anyone seeking to understand consciousness, truth, religion, or human flourishing seriously. He earned his reputation as America's greatest philosopher through work that still speaks to anyone willing to engage it deeply.